Welcome to all of you in person and on Zoom. I want to begin by naming the ESC's commitment and my own commitment to all the people of the Holy Land, to the Israeli Jews, to the Arab Muslims, to our Palestinian Christian companions, and the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Jordan and Holy Land. My task today is to do the history, but first I want to just give you a bit of the context from my perspective and my engagement. In 2000, can everybody hear me? Yes. And on Zoom, everybody here on Zoom, I hope?
If you speak that loudly, yes.
Okay, I will speak loudly. From 2006 to 2011, I was the staff coordinator for the ELC's Middle East Peace Strategy at Churchwide Office. But I got another identity. I'm a lifelong academic and denominational volunteer dedicated to friendship with and understanding of our Muslim and Jewish siblings. And I think these two realities demonstrate my attempt to have a Lutheran both and approach to things like the conflict in the Middle East. But I also don't hesitate to share the stories of our Palestinian sisters and brothers in the Holy Land. There are 6 Lutheran congregations in the Holy Land, Jerusalem, West Bank, and Jordan, headed by Palestinian Lutheran pastors. There have been Palestinian Lutherans for about 170 years in the Holy Land, and of course Christians for 2,023 years. And they also sponsor schools and social services that serve Christians and Muslims in the Holy Land. And I should say, I've made 3 visits to these churches and these schools, and they teach and preach reconciliation, brotherhood with all the people of Israel and Palestine, peace, etc. This ongoing crisis, as you know, is extremely complex and emotional for many people. So the 3 of us each have a role today, and we are reading from scripts. I'm not at the moment, but I will start reading from my script so that we don't elaborate and take each other's time. My job is to do a concise history since 1914. Then Ryan will give some consideration of the terminology. And then Raneem, who is the descendant of Palestinian refugees to Jordan and then immigrants to the United States, will share a very personal story, and we'll end with a few educational and advocacy tools. In fact, there's going to be 2 resources put in the chat, and then also online, the website where the link for this, I think, will house, we hope, a link to the recording and also to two things. We collaborated on a sheet of takeaways and also on a double-sided sheet of many, many resources for education and advocacy. We tried to get quite a wide spectrum of perspectives, but I personally put an asterisk by the ones, if you only have time to read like 6 of the 50 things we've suggested, this might be a good place to start. So that will be in the chat and also on the website. We also are going to not stop until the end. So unfortunately, you don't have anything to write questions on. So keep your questions and comments in your head for the end. Okay, to start. Okay, start. Did I do there? Okay, go back. There. All right. In 1914, this is what the Ottoman Empire looked like. The green area to the east of the Mediterranean included the province of Palestine and Greater Syria, etc., all the green on the map. And then something big happened with World War I. The Turks, the Ottoman Turks, who had controlled this whole area for 450 years, fought on the losing side with the Germans. And so their land was taken over and divided up between mandates assigned to Britain and France. So Britain was given control over what is today Israel, Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, and Saudi Arabia, and France over Syria and Lebanon. And by the way, the term Palestine that was used during the Ottoman Empire for this region comes from the Roman term for Philistia, the coastal plain. So it's a very old term for that region. So, by the way, I should say the mandate control was really just to be caretakers for the peoples in these territories that had been under the Turks until they were strong enough to stand on their own 2 feet and give them their independence. But there are some problematic results of this whole period in history. First of all, France and Britain drew the boundaries around the countries, and they often drew them to satisfy their own economic and strategic interests, not the interests of the local inhabitants. Secondly, they set up secular governments. Britain used its, its constitutional monarchy, limited monarchy form. So Iraq and Jordan got that, but France applied its parliamentary form to Syria and Lebanon, and they still have those governing styles today as independent countries, mostly from the late 40s. But often Arab tribal leadership styles didn't mesh well with those European Western forms of government. These developments, I think, that I just quickly described were part of the causes for the long Lebanese civil war and for Iraq's 1990 invasion of Kuwait. Problems stemming back from the boundaries being drawn and the governments being set up, not by the people themselves. Then the third thing, the mid-19th century saw the creation of the modern state of Israel, a very positive outcome for the world's Jews. But the continuing conflict and the long occupation have been tragic in many ways for the Palestinian residents of this former province and British Mandate. Now you can see, oops, I can get the thing to advance. And here you can see the modern day boundaries. Greater Israel is the sort of chartreuse green, and the medium or darker green is the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. To quickly summarize what happened after World War I, you can see the population in 1918. Britain, of course, gained mandate control over what will become Israel in 1918, and they issued a famous declaration called the Balfour Declaration that opened the area to immigration by Jews who really needed a homeland and were invited in. But the Balfour Declaration also pledged to protect the rights of the pre-existing Palestinian population. And so lots of Jews did immigrate to the region, and Britain's control over the mandate became much more problematic when Zionist militant groups and Palestinian Arab groups started fighting with each other over territory. And so the United Nations stepped in and offered a plan that gave the Jews, Zionist Jews, 55% and the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, 45% of the former Turkish province. That plan was rejected by the Arabs and their neighboring states, and war ensued. The war was won by the Zionists and led to the creation of the State of Israel in 1948-49 on 78% of the territory that was in dispute. Then in the 1967-Six Day War, Israel captured the Gaza Strip that had been controlled by Egypt, Jordan, the West Bank of the Jordan River that had been under the control of Jordan, and the Golan Heights that had been part of Syria. Then another big thing happened in 1978 with the Camp David Peace Treaty, returned the Sinai to Egypt and part of the Golan Heights to Syria. Now to bring us up to the present day, this is the fastest Middle East history, I think, ever. It's the fastest one I've ever done, fastest one probably we'll ever hear. So more recent developments. Despite periods of terrorist violence by Palestinian militants and harsh military reprisals by Israel, there have been interim peace agreements, such as the Oslo Accords, that gave Palestinians some control over part of the West Bank. And international consensus over these years, including the US and the United Nations, has led to a broad consensus for a land for peace approach to create a viable, independent Palestine and a secure, recognized Israel at peace with its regional neighbors. And historically, both the United States government and the ELCA have advocated this outcome. Now, who's Hamas? Well, Hamas arose in 1980. There's a very long history of Hamas, but briefly, Hamas arose in 1908 after the first Palestinian Intifada, or popular uprising, as the main rival to Yasser Arafat's Fatah Party and the Palestinian Liberation Organization, or PLO. Ironically, initially, Israel tolerated and even welcomed Hamas as a counterweight to the dreaded PLO. More recently, a host of events and factors have weakened both the government of Israel and the Palestinian Authority, that's the alternate to Hamas, over the West Bank, stifling initiatives by them for peace. Here are some of those. the takeover of Gaza by Hamas, which I'll get to in a minute, wars and blockades imposed on Gaza, sporadic violence on both sides, dysfunction and disunity among both Palestinian and Israeli leaders, and a big one from 1994 onward, the expansion of Israeli settlements in the occupied West Bank. Now in 2023, there are, I think, 700,000 or 500,000 settlers on occupied West Bank land, plus 200,000 more settlers in annexed East Jerusalem. All these settlements are considered illegal under international law, but Israel claims that the West Bank is disputed, not occupied territory. Gaza and Hamas. You can see how small the Gaza Strip is. 25 miles long, 7 miles wide, Mediterranean on one side, on the right side, yes, Mediterranean on one side, and Israel and Egypt on the others. It has over 2 million people, 40% of whom are children under the age of 15. According to the UN, of these 2 million plus people, more than 1.4 million of the residents of the Gaza Strip are Palestinian refugees and their descendants from 1948, when Greater Israel was created. Israel occupied Gaza in the 1967 war, but then in 2005, it decided to withdraw troops and about 7,000 settlers, but it continued having control over fuel, water, electricity, and the movement of goods and people in and out of Gaza, even before the current crisis. Then in 2006, and by the way, that's the last time the Palestinians have had a legislative council election, Hamas got a plurality of seats, but they got more than any other single party. And so they then sort of declared themselves, kind of in charge, and eventually in 2007 militarily expelled the forces loyal to Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian Authority. So they were already there, but then in 2007 they officially took over, leaving the Palestinian Authority over control over parts of the West Bank. And a lot of that happens from the very vibrant and busy city of Ramallah that Ryan and I have been fortunate to visit. It's important to know that the vast majority of Gazan residents did not vote in the 2006 election. Many of them were not born yet, and many were children already in 2006. So it's obviously been a long time. Hamas has two wings, one political and one military. The military wing is responsible, of course, for the repeated attacks on the Israelis. Today, however, the political wing has been offering social services since 2005 and really since 2007 both. And they get a lot of their financial support for both military and social programs from Iran. That's well known. Iran contributes weapons and training. But also, maybe not so well known, is the nation of Qatar, through the UN, helps fund civil services, aid to the poor, the power grid, etc. And all of that is in part to compensate for the lack of those things coming from Israel after Israel withdrew. Despite the designation of Hamas as a terror organization by, of course, Israel, the US, and many Western nations, it's not well known that prior to the brutal attacks of October 7th, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had tolerated its existence as a caretaker for the millions of people in the Gaza Strip. Here's a picture of the Gaza Strip, and you can see refugee camps. There are refugee camps that have been there since 1948, so 75 years. They are no longer tents in most cases. They are concrete tenement kinds of dwellings, I think it's important to know that in addition to the massive bombing campaign, Israel has cut the water supply, destroyed the power stations, and prohibited importation of fuel to run generators to power hospitals, for example. So this morning, Ryan and I were listening to the BBC coverage at 5 a.m., literally, and they were describing 45 babies who had been in incubators in neonatal units in the main hospital in Gaza City, trying to find a way to transport them to some other place where they could get back in incubators. And so that's just a aside from this morning. So pretty much now in the whole Gaza Strip, there's no electricity, no water, no safe water, and the hospitals are pretty much in crisis. Last month, 520 aid trucks were allowed in through the Rafah port crossing connected to Egypt. So 528 aid trucks sounds like a lot. That's in a month. That's the number that were coming in daily, according to the UN, before the crisis. So that gives you a little sense. Finally, I'm not going to read this last horribly depressing slide, but I'll just let you skim it while I conclude. One last point. Many Palestinians, and especially Gazans, are not Hamas supporters. There was a survey conducted by Arab Monitor just days before the crisis erupted on October 7th. The vast majority of Gazans said that they are frustrated with Hamas's ineffective governance, and they are all enduring, many of them, extreme economic hardship. Many also do not align themselves with Hamas's ideology either. Unlike Hamas, whose goal is to destroy the Israeli state, the majority of survey respondents, and this is just like a month and a half ago, favored two states, an independent Palestine and Israel existing side by side. Sadly, past Israeli crackdowns have made life, like the current one, that have made life difficult for ordinary Gazans, only increase support for Hamas. We can just hope, or I can hope and pray, that principal leaders on all sides will work toward a negotiated end to the hostilities and lay the groundwork for true peace and justice for both the Israelis and the Palestinians. And if you take a look at some of the resources that we've included in the 2-page list of URLs, you will see that there are many American and Israeli groups and people that support this outcome also. Next, Ryan will talk about the importance of examining the words that are being used when we talk about the current situation.
Thank you. So do you have to unshare screen so I can share?
I'm sorry, what I do. First, I have to end show. Stop share. Thank you.
All right. Let's see that. Okay, cool. It worked. So I'm not going to give an introduction of myself, except to say that my educational field is language and literature, and I taught literature for many years. And what I want to talk about is the use of language, which we don't pay attention to enough. I mean, anybody who's ever tried to teach students literature knows they don't pay much attention to language, but it has a lot of hidden things in it. So that's what I want to talk about, mainly as a tool to help you understand what's going on and to encourage you to be skeptical of the language that you hear or read when you're reading or hearing about the situation right now.
You want to do a sound check?
Can people hear me okay? Okay, cool. Moving on. So word choices often contain emotional nuances that we don't pay a whole lot of attention to. So I picked these, have nothing to do with the Middle East, but the difference between anti-abortion and pro-life. I mean, for a while, people who call themselves pro-life were in the anti-abortion movement, but that didn't work very well. People didn't like that. It was negative. Similarly, on the other side, nobody wants to be pro-abortion. You want to be pro-choice. So again, we hear these words, we don't pay attention to the fact that there's a nuance behind them. And I also want to apologize that I'm going to read a lot of text, but I wanted to have background so that it's not my opinion necessarily. So here's 4 ways that I found in the media that they talk about the current situation. It's the Israel-Hamas war, the Israel-Gaza war, the Israeli-Palestinian war, and the Israel-Palestine war. So what's the difference? Does it matter? So the implication of this one is that the war is limited to Hamas. So don't pay attention to any other unintended collateral damage because we're really after Hamas. Then there's the Israel-Gaza war. The implication here is that it's limited to Gaza, but we know if we pay attention, it's not. Things are going on in the West Bank as well. The Israel-Palestinian war implies that Israel's fighting all Palestinians, not just Hamas. And then the Israel-Palestine war, the implication of that is that Palestine is a separate national entity. So you can guess who might choose to use which of these descriptions of what's going on. Okay, so wait a minute, excuse me, I have to get rid of, all right, because I can't even read it. Okay, let's start with the word terrorism. This is the definition of terrorism from the UN General Assembly. I'm just going to read the highlighted part. Criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the general public, a group of persons or particular persons for political purposes are in any circumstance unjustifiable. So that's the UN definition. The United States has its own definition. Premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated, wow, a lot of big words, against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents. And I would argue that using big words like that helps to obfuscate what's behind this thing. And then I just threw in a quotation from Kofi Annan when he was Secretary General of the UN, which is much simpler. What is clear and what we can all agree on is any deliberate attack on innocent civilians or non-combatants, regardless of one's cause, is unacceptable and fits into the definition of terrorism. So, okay, not moving forward. Try this thing. There we go. Okay, some of the things that complicate that definition. First of all, the word terrorist is extremely negative. Okay, there's no argument about that. Nobody says, "Oh, I want to be a terrorist." Okay, so when we accept that as labeling something, then you can't really argue very well about what motivated them. Nobody wants to hear about the motivation of the people who are terrorists. So that shuts off discussion immediately. So it's a very useful word, again, depending on what side you're on. The other thing to note is that the people who defined terrorism were the nation states, the governments of countries. It was either the United States in the one we read or the UN. Okay, so what did they leave out? Nation states. So nations can't be terrorists according to the definition that the UN has. So no matter what they do, even if they do all this stuff to scare the civilian population and all that, it can't be considered terrorism. So that's kind of useful if you're a nation state. And then the definition of who are innocent civilians or non-combatants is open. I mean, people can argue about that. So that terrorism is a complicated thing. The other thing we've heard a lot about is who has a right to the land between the river, the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. So I saw this quotation in the New York Times. I have a little picture there, but this article said that President Biden had told a story of meeting Golda Meir several times a day, sometimes, they said, relating how she assured him about Israeli resilience by saying that Jews had a secret weapon in their struggle for Israel. We have nowhere else to go. Okay. So whatever she meant by that, and I have my ideas, but I'm not even going to argue that, that Jews have nowhere else to go, okay, but Israel. Factually, that's not true. We know that. There's Jews all over the world. And even if there were people coming on ships, the original Zionist movement was to put them in Africa, in what's now Kenya. And so the other implication is that the Arabs, the Palestinian Arabs, have other places to go. There's been a lot of talk. Why don't they just move to Egypt or other Arab countries? Okay, so I want you to pay attention to the idea of Arab. Okay, that Arab is not a racial term, it's not an ethnic term, and it's not a religious term. It's a linguistic term. People who speak Arabic as their native language are considered Arabs. So there's a lot of difference among Arabs, even in their language, by the way. I mean, if you speak Arabic like Syrians and Palestinians and Lebanese do, and you go to Saudi Arabia, unless you speak classical Arabic, you don't understand what they're saying. It's completely different vocabulary. So I think it's like Latino and Latina. I mean, everybody who speaks Spanish, why don't the refugees from Venezuela go to some other Spanish-speaking country? All right, there's room for them because it's a Spanish-speaking country. Why don't they just go there? there's another phrase that's been used a lot, and for a people without a land without people. And it's often attributed to Zionists, and many of them use that, but actually that phrase came from British Christians, the evangelicals of the time, who wanted Jews to return to Israel so Jesus would come back in the second coming, like many evangelicals in the United States believe now. So that term wasn't coined by the Zionists, even though many of them use that. Similarly, the thing about from the river to the sea, free from the river to the sea, that's been interpreted now, and maybe some use it that way, as an effort to eliminate Israel. But originally, in the 1920s, that was the native Palestinian Arabs arguing, don't divide up our land and give some to them and leave some for us. Let's all live together on this land. That's what they meant by that phrase. Let's make one country and we'll all get along and live together. Okay, now the thing about colonialism. There's been a lot of discussion of colonialism. Say, well, this is an anti-colonialist thing. I just want to add, this is about whose land it is. The Zionist Vladimir Jabotinsky, one of the early Zionists in 1925, he was a leader of Zionists, wrote that Zionism is a colonization adventure. They saw it as colonization. They knew there were people there. They knew it wasn't a land without people. No matter what the British evangelical said, they knew there were people there. And his argument in this paragraph is, we have to have an army because they're not going to let us come in and take over their land. Remember, this period was a colonial period. I mean, the Europeans were moving into Africa. They were moving into lots of different places. So colonialism wasn't as negative as it is now. The idea that Palestinian Arabs can go elsewhere stems from the argument that Palestinian Arabs came from other Arab countries later. Like when Islam came in, they came in from other Arab countries. There's lots of arguments. I mean, I would encourage you to go to Google Image and just put in something like Jerusalem 1890 or Jaffa 1890 and see all the buildings and things that were there. I mean, obviously it wasn't empty. But I think the coolest thing is that recently archaeological geneticists did a study. They took DNA, they dug up graves of what we would call, from the Bible, Canaanites. Okay, Phoenicians, Canaanites. And they extracted DNA from them and they scoped it out. And then they took DNA from the local people living in Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Israel. And what they said was 58% of those people have the same genes as the Canaanites had, which means they were there thousands of years ago. And the other thing it means is they're siblings. I mean, interesting. Okay, anti-Semitism. This one's tough and complicated. But I just put this picture in here in Harvard that some students said that Israel was entirely responsible for the violence that went on. Okay, you can certainly disagree with that factually, or you can agree with it factually, but they were branded anti-Semites for saying that, and they were doxxed. Their information was put all over the internet, and they got all kinds of attacks. You can see this truck that went around with their pictures on it in Cambridge. Okay, so quickly, the definitions of anti-Semitism are very big, but I picked out these things. So Anne Frankhouse in the Netherlands is a source. They said, anyone is free to reject or criticize the political decisions of Israeli governments concerning the Palestinian territories. This is not uncommon in Israel itself. So this is when they're defining anti-Semitism. Holding Jews individually or collectively responsible for Israel's policies and actions is a form of anti-Semitism. No one is personally responsible for the deeds of their compatriots or fellow believers or for the governmental policies. So on the other side, is it okay that Palestinians are responsible for what Hamas did? If Jews are not responsible for what Israel does, I mean, Israeli Jews. So, I mean, that's an interesting parallel, I think. And then I like this article. It's from 2003, so it's not about this particular case, but it's by a woman writer who in the London Review of Books. She says, so what do we make of Jews such as myself, who are emotionally invested in the state of Israel, critical of its current form, and call for radical restructuring of its economic and juridical basis precisely because we are invested in it? If one can't voice an objection to violence done by Israel without attracting a charge of anti-Semitism, then that charge works to circumscribe the publicly acceptable domain of speech and to immunize Israeli violence against criticism. Okay, that's an Israeli Jew. And then there was a thing where hundreds of Jewish writers, this is recent, this is in the last couple of weeks, signed this thing saying they don't like the use of anti-Semitism because it shuts down criticism of Israel and what it's doing. And lastly, I want to talk about collective punishment. So what collective punishment, international law posits, this is from the Doctors Without Borders. International law posits that no person may be punished for the acts that he or she did not commit. It ensures that the collective punishment of a group of persons for a crime committed by an individual or other group is forbidden. So this is going on now, and the argument is, well, they supported Hamas, so it's okay. I mean, we don't want to do it, but if they die, they die. And what I thought about is all those TV shows you see with cops on them, where some criminal grabs an innocent person and puts them in front of them. What would we think if the cop shot right through that person to get the bad guy? We would say, oh, yeah, you can't do that. But that's what collective punishment is. It's like, well, sorry, you just happen to be in the way. We're trying to get these bad guys. And I know it's more complicated than a TV show, but I think it's something we need to think about. The Red Cross says collective punishment was historically used as a deterrence tool by occupying powers to prevent attacks from resistance movements. Collective punishments for acts committed by individuals during an armed conflict are prohibited by international humanitarian law against prisoners of war or other protected persons. So there's a long history of this kind of thing. So what I hope you'll at least take away from this is think, I never thought of that before, so I'm going to think more about this whole thing and not just accept what I hear. And now I want to pass it over to Raneem.
Thank you, Ryan and Carol, for your diligent research and commitment to truth and justice. The world is a much better place with you in it. I could truly write a book with how much I want to say about this, but this is a start. I want to take a moment to thank you all for attending, and let us take a deep breath together. Do one more. I'm also reading off a script because if not, I will talk for freedom. I acknowledge that if you're joining us today, you came to us with an open heart, and regardless of where you stand on the issue, you are here to bear witness. I'm going to follow myself. That is no small feat. Our only path forward is one that we take together. You being here shows me that you care about the loss of any life, and that you understand that our liberation and oppression as people is tied up in one another's. None of us are free until all of us are free. I did not think that my body could hold as much grief, as much rage, despair, sadness, betrayal, or heartbreak than I have in the last 36 days. When the October 7th attacks happened, I rushed to my group chats and called my family to see if they knew what was going on. Over the next few days, I watched in horror as the most brutal siege on Gaza in history had begun, and it is still not over. As of 3 days ago, 25,000 tons of explosives have rained in Gaza, a 25-mile-long strip, equivalent to 2 nuclear bombs. It took me a few days to realize the degree to which this became worldwide news. I remember being in shock when I opened my social media to see that celebrities on every side were talking about this. I was surprised because I, like so many other Arabs in diaspora, am no stranger to witnessing indiscriminate brutality against the Palestinian people, and no stranger to witnessing the strategic silencing by Western powers trying to hide or justify it. To be Arab American, to be Arab in diaspora or in exile, is to be intimately and often painfully aware of every bullet, every bomb, every embargo, every settlement, every occupier, every restriction on food, on water, on fuel, every act of surveillance, every violence, big and small, to our people and to our homelands. I was shocked that finally, after 75 years of colonization, occupation, ethnic cleansing, forced displacement, mass killings and bombings in Palestine, that it was finally garnering public attention. We have witnessed two Nakbas in Palestinian history. Nakba it means catastrophe in Arabic. It was the term coined by Palestinians to talk about the mass displacement and settlements in 1948 and 1967, as Carol had outlined. I was even more shocked when I began uncovering what narrative was being pumped out of Western media outlets, that Biden was claiming that Gazans were lying about the death counts, that anyone who was saying anything critical about Israel was suddenly considered an anti-Semite, and shut down any kind of conversation around it, both from Israeli, Western, and US media outlets, just blatant lies and misinformation, talking about Hamas having beheaded 40 babies, which was debunked days later, but the damage had already been done. I couldn't believe my eyes that I was about to experience another war on terror within my lifetime. In the early 2000s, we witnessed over 200,000 innocent Iraqis be mercilessly slaughtered by US forces in the name of eradicating terrorists. It wasn't until 20 years later that the CIA revealed the justifications they had for the war were falsified, and it became apparent that the motives behind this war were oil and other profits gained by destabilizing one of the most prosperous countries in the Middle East. That was not the beginning, and it definitely was not the end to US interference and destabilization in the Middle East. I first visited my family in Jordan in 2007 when I was 12 years old. I spent the entire summer baking in the heat, seeking shade under dozens of fruit trees in the grove at my great-grandfather's house. My dad would sit next to me, cracking open apricot pits with a stone, revealing sweet, velvety nuts in the center. I exclaimed, "I didn't know that you could eat the inside of these pits." He said, "They're different in America. They're bitter and they're toxic." And I thought to myself, that's fitting. I met so many family members that I didn't know existed that summer, my dad's brothers and sister, my grandparents' siblings, and what seemed like an endless stream of relatives that we would just refer to as cousins or aunties. We bounced from house to house, visiting people who would offer us feasts and fruits and candies, hugging my dad like they hadn't seen him in a decade, and hugging me just the same. That summer, we drove around and visited holy sites in Syria and Lebanon. We crossed the Red Sea and visited a beach town in Egypt, and we floated in the Dead Sea that separates Jordan from Palestine and occupied Palestine. It's the lowest point on earth. I fell deeply in love with life there. It felt like home, and I began to understand the longing of my community to return. The next time I visited was in 2015 when I was 20 years old, following the aftermath of the war in Syria. When we got off the plane, I thought I had remembered it all wrong. Driving home from the airport to my uncle's house, nothing felt the same. Every street was congested. The drive from the airport that used to be 20 minutes was now an hour plus. So many people were walking up and down the road selling trinkets or panhandling. We got into Pis, the small rural village that my family hails from, the only Christian town in the country, and it was just as overcrowded. I had never seen so many people in this tiny corner of the earth. Inflation was high. A box of cereal was 6 dinars when it used to be 2. Clothes were expensive. Supermarkets were expensive. And my cousins were all having a hard time making ends meet with so much more competition for labor. I had watched the Syrian civil war unfold in 2011 from afar, and I knew that Jordan, their neighbor to the south, had taken in a lot of displaced people and refugees, but I had no idea the extent. The following summer in 2016, I won an award to do an independent research project for my university. I chose to go back to Jordan and do qualitative interviews on what happened. I got a pool of participants from every walk of life across Jordan, north to south, which is about 60% of Illinois, comparatively. And I asked, how did the refugee crisis impact your daily life? And was consistently met with, which one? That summer illustrated for me the legacy of Western imperialism in the Middle East, how many countries broke into war following destabilization efforts, and how many people were internally displaced. I miss the way the air smells. I miss the fruit stands along the side of the road. I miss the language and the music, the food, and my family. When I see daily destruction of Gaza, watch videos from the remaining journalists on the ground of charred bodies, parents holding their dead children to the skies, hoping for someone to listen, the people who have survived the bombings just to be on the brink of dying by starvation and dehydration because Israel has cut them off from the world, I cannot help but see myself and my family in them. They look like my family. They talk like my family. They eat the same food as my family, and it so easily could have been my family. Had my great-grandfather made even slightly different choices, that could have been me, and in so many ways it is. My heart breaks with every life lost to the occupation. I know that I have the opinion that I do today because of where I come from and who my family is, but if there's one thing I know about this congregation, it's that Holy Trinity. The members of Holy Trinity show up here because of what we stand for. Anti-racism, anti-oppression, and acceptance of all regardless of creed or color. We cannot talk about anti-racism work without talking about the vilification of Arabs and Muslims, or without talking about how white supremacy plays into colonization. As Ryan cited, Israel began as a colonial project, and its existence today is predicated on the decimation of Palestinian spirit and eventually their lives. These concepts are inextricably linked. If you have ever reflected on the greatest atrocities in the history of humankind, the genocide and colonization of the indigenous Americans, South African apartheid, transatlantic slavery, the Holocaust, the Vietnam War, and thought to yourself, I would have done something. I would have stood up for what is right. I wouldn't have let them fool me. I wouldn't have fallen to this propaganda. I wouldn't have followed everyone as they were walking off the cliff. I urge you to find your place in this movement to end the siege in Gaza. We are actively witnessing the genocide of the Palestinians and total destruction of Gaza. Israel claims that they're just trying to retaliate against Hamas, but they have a 95% civilian kill rate. The average of the over 10,000 Palestinians who have been killed to date is, the average age is 5 years old. They claim that Hamas is hiding under the hospitals, so they bomb every hospital in sight. They give 24-hour notice for 1.1 million people to flee from northern Gaza to southern Gaza, or they will be killed. And then they bomb the roads while civilians try to make their way to safety while holding white flags above them. They're targeting journalists and their families, hospitals, schools, and homes. They are marching people while taunting them with rifles in hand. And soldiers are posting pictures to Instagram with Israeli flags in the sand, bragging about how they have reconquered Gaza. Settlers who were born in New York, New Jersey, California, and all across Europe, who came to Israel in the 60s and beyond, are excited to get their beach town back and are already talking to city planners. As we speak, Israel is bulldozing the rubble of the destruction of Gaza to make room for a new settlement. When asked if the Palestinians will return to Gaza, Israeli officials refer to it as the Nakba of 2023. It didn't start with Gaza, and it will not end with Gaza. As we speak, Israelis in the occupied West Bank are being handed AK-47s from their government to protect their land and are assaulting and killing Palestinians with total impunity. It does not end in Palestine or the occupied territories either. In the first 2 weeks of the siege, a 6-year-old boy in Plainfield, Illinois, was stabbed to death by their landlord, a 70-year-old man who was screaming, "You Muslims must die," during the attack. This was days after Netanyahu's media advisor tweeted that the Palestinians were human animals and children of darkness. I grew up terrified of what may happen to my family. Sitting at a restaurant with them and their volume gets a little too high and they're speaking Arabic and we're clearly brown in the middle of Ohio. That fear never left and it has only increased tenfold. I'm terrified that they'll be caught in the wrong place at the wrong time, speaking Arabic in public or looking too brown to pass as ethnically ambiguous. As a child, I feared every day when my dad would come home late when he was working plumbing calls in rural Ohio because I feared he would be killed in a hate crime. And they wouldn't know that he watches football every Sunday like any American dad. And they wouldn't know that his favorite song was by the Fugees or that his life was just as precious as theirs. They would only see this brown Arab man as a threat, as a terrorist, as a child of darkness, because their government told them so and the media backed it up. You may feel like you have no power or no say about what happens in Gaza, that it's a million miles away and the politics of it are too complicated to understand. But my hope is that you leave here today with the seedlings of recognition that we are all responsible for each other. And that by not taking a stand to urge for an immediate ceasefire, to end the genocide and end the occupation, we are compromising our humanity. The US gives $3.8 billion of aid to Israel every year, with nearly 153 million of it coming from Illinois. These are American-made and funded bombs that are tearing apart homes and hospitals and schools and killing over tens of thousands of Palestinians. Our tax dollars are directly and materially contributing to this destruction. You may feel hopeless, like you don't know where to start, or that you need more information to feel resolute in taking action. But I'm here to tell you that the path to hope and resolution is action. Chicago is home to the largest Palestinian population in the United States. There are actions and mobilizations happening every day, and even if you aren't protesting in the streets, you can call your representatives to demand an immediate ceasefire. Though I am heartbroken beyond belief, though I feel betrayed by this world and begin to lose faith in humanity, I'm filled with hope for the generations to come. We have seen the horrors of war unfold in our histories, and people are filling the streets saying never again and not in my name. Millions of people around the world are mobilizing for Palestine, and it brings me to tears. I am reminded of a quote from Arundhati Roy. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet night, I can hear her breathing. I pray for a quiet night in Gaza. I believe another world is on her way, and I hope that you will join me in welcoming her.